Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. I'm Willie Wilson, I'm Chairman of Perth Civic Trust, and it's our turn to chair the Fothergill Lecture this year. This has now become a Perth institution, and like many Perth institutions, it's one that thrives. Look at the place, we're absolutely full. It's a cold winter's night, but there's a warm welcome to you all. Tonight, we've got a very special talk. Dr. Lucy Dean is a senior lecturer in history in the University of the Highlands and Islands. Lucy is a senior lecturer and interim head of the Centre for History at UHI, which she's described to me as a challenging role. And I think you understand. And she's collaborated with Professor Richard Oram in the University of Stirling and KPC, Perth Kinross Archives, and other local organisations on the Perth Charterhouse Project for several years. Now, there's lots more to say, but I'm going to leave Lucy to say a lot about the background to the project as well.
It's a real honour to be speaking for the Rhoda Fothergill Memorial Lecture. It's a huge honour, so I'm very grateful, and very grateful that you all came out on such a cold and miserable evening to listen to me. So the Perth Carthusian priory, the Charterhouse, is one of Scotland's least understood but most historically significant medieval monastic sites. Co-founded by James I and Joan Beaufort in the 15th century, with the express purpose of being their joint mausoleum, but destroyed during the Scottish Reformation, it leaves no obvious above-ground remains in the modern Perth landscape. It has been an intermittent focus of local historians, including Robert Scott Fittis and Rhoda Fothergill herself. But it's still something of an enigma. On the 1st of July 1914, a monument was raised by the Historic Sites Committee of Perth to commemorate the Carthusian Charterhouse as part of a concerted effort by the Town Council to provide reminders of the borough's lost historic buildings. In addition to the Charterhouse and other religious buildings targeted during the Reformation, many of Perth's medieval buildings have been lost to the ravages of time, with a few notable exceptions, of course, such as the parish church of St John's. Perth's lost medieval built heritage was seen as a challenge to overcome, and the initiative of raising the Charterhouse monument in 1914 and others like it were designed to generate local interest in Perth's past and to attract visitors. These aims are relatable in the present, but generating more meaningful, community-centred interactions with genuinely transformative potential for those communities has risen to the fore in more recent decades, and since the early days of the project way back in 2016, it's through engagement with such that the Perth Charterhouse Project seeks to make these meaningful contributions. The project seeks to build wider public understanding of Perth's central role in later medieval Scotland, and using the Carthusian priory as a case study, reconnect modern audiences with a sense of place in the present through exploring the city's medieval past. When so much of Perth's medieval built heritage has been lost, it's important to reflect briefly on why this foundation emerged as a primary focus. For those not already in the know, and I appreciate some of you very much are, so apologies for that, this foundation was the only Carthusian house founded in Scotland, despite many monastic houses being founded over the centuries. It was also the last royal monastic foundation of this scale in Scotland, as well as the last purpose-built royal mausoleum, giving intriguing royal connections. It was also relatively unusual for a Carthusian house, as it was founded beside the borough of Perth rather than in splendid rural isolation, as was generally, although not exclusively, the preference of the Carthusians. The underexplored surviving documentary evidence for the foundation and the Perth and Kinross Archaeological Research Framework's observation that the Carthusian house is a site of significant interest but has not received much focus in terms of archaeology were also incredibly alluring. So our activities are threefold. in their focus as listed on the slide. I'm not going to read them out, I'm sure you can take that in. And to embrace all of these aims, this project is and always has been a collaborative one. In addition to myself, the main project collaborators are Professor Richard Oram of the University of Stirling and local partners including Perth and Kinross Archives, Culture Perth and Kinross, and Gavin Lindsay, who's a local consultant in archaeological education, interpretation and research. Our most recent activities have involved partnerships with AOC Archaeology, who undertook the ground penetrating radar scanning that I'll be speaking about later on, the residents of the former Charterhouse Precinct site and the Society of Antiquities of Scotland with funding from the Strathmartin Trust. We've also been developing stronger connections with the King James VI Hospital, the Perth Guildry and PSNS, as well as having many other friends of the project, including David Bowler and Older Archaeology. Tonight I'm speaking on behalf of and with assistance of this collaborative whole, and with thanks to all who have contributed, and consequently there will be some things that I can answer questions more easily about than others. This talk will explore two interconnected strands of research ongoing as part of the Perth Charterhouse Project: the documentary research, which has been the core of my personal involvement, and our first phase of non-invasive archaeology. It will explore some new insights arising from the research into the documentary evidence held both at the National Records of Scotland and in Perth and Kinross Archive, with a focus on what we can discover about the pious activities and motivations for those donating to the Carthusians during the 15th and 16th centuries. Then it will provide information about our initial phase of ground penetrating radar, or GPR scanning, which is what I'll call it for the rest of it, so I don't have that mouthful each time, was undertaken at the site in September 2024, and subsequently and the subsequent community-based activities, with some concluding reflections on unfolding plans for the project. Like many monastic orders, the Carthusian order declined in popularity in the 13th century, but their austerity and reputation as spiritual intercessors won new supporters in the late 14th and 15th centuries, especially among the military elite of France and England, with whom James I of Scotland had significant interactions. James I was captured aged 12 in 1406 when travelling to France for his own protection, and was then a prisoner in England until 1424. As a guest of Henry V, on the left of the slide, James would have seen the English King's Charterhouse at Sheen, depicted in a 16th century sketch in the centre of this slide, which was located close to Henry's favourite palace. Moreover, James's wife Joan Beaufort was niece to Thomas Beaufort, Earl of Dorset, who was a key patron of the Mount Grace Priory in Yorkshire and was buried there in 1429, and we'll return to this house in Yorkshire a little bit later on. Founding a Carthusian house with the express purpose of creating a mausoleum was also increasingly in vogue in the same period. Sir Walter Manny founded the Charterhouse on the edge of London as to be buried before its altar, while the Carthusian house at Champmol near Dijon in Burgundy was founded by Philip the Bold, Duke of Burgundy, and his wife Margaret of Flanders as a ducal mausoleum. While there was much inspiration for the young couple to draw upon when making their joint royal pious statement in founding the house as a mausoleum, James Hogg has demonstrated that it was very unlikely that the complex was complete by the time James I was murdered in 1437, even if the church was ready to receive his burial. There was some limited continued royal interest in the foundation after James I's death, but subsequent royal gifts to the Carthusians, such as an annual gift of the provision of wine for the use and sustenance of the brothers from James II in 1454, tend to be quite minor in nature. Research into the extant documentary records reveals that a significant number of surviving grants of money, land and properties to the Carthusian community came from local people, including nobility, merchant elites and other residents of the borough, which suggests there were many others beyond the King and the Queens of Scots who sought to invest in the potency of the prayers of the Carthusians. So while other religious orders were increasingly treated with cynicism and pious patronage was largely aimed elsewhere, such as chantry chapels, parish church altars and universities, Why then was the Carthusian order one in which royalty and people more generally sought to invest in this time? So one of the most commonly understood reasons for the renewed appeal of the Carthusians in this environment was rooted in their austere lifestyle of largely solo contemplation. Carthusian monasteries were designed to facilitate the isolated lives of collective hermits that was prescribed by the rule devised by the order's founder, Saint Bruno, as can be seen in this plan of the Charterhouse at Clermont in France. Each monk lived in a separate house with its own garden. So you can see one of these in the top corner there. The house has got the cross in it and the garden is the L shape around it. And the church was one of the few places where the monks came together on roughly a weekly basis, and that was usually in the centre of the site, but it was usually quite small. When we think of monastic churches being quite large, these were usually quite small churches. In the first section of this talk, I want to dig deeper into the question of why the people of Perth and its surrounds invested into Carthusian prayers by looking at what surviving textual records reveal about why their donations were made and what connections they may have forged between the borough and the monastic community. So this quote from James III's letter of February 1472, when the king had to intervene on behalf of the Carthusians at Perth in a dispute with the aldermen of the borough, implies the relationship between the borough inhabitants and the monastic community was not one without conflict. Notably, it tends to be these conflicts between the Carthusian community and the borough that are dominant features of the existing scholarship about the Carthusians of Perth. Before digging into what we can learn about why people made donations to the Carthusians, it's important to comment on why that is the case. The Carthusian house, as with most monastic foundations, was a significant land and property owner. Mary Blackfordshire has demonstrated that, with a particular focus on the decades immediately preceding 1560, that the Carthusian priors, such as Simon Galloway and Adam Foreman, were proactive and even quite ruthless in contesting and securing the rights of the Charterhouse. Due to the solitary and largely isolated lives of the monks themselves, for most borough inhabitants, their direct interaction would primarily have been with these sorts of individuals who worked to protect the land and properties that facilitated the solitary devotional lives of the monastic inhabitants. Indeed, much about the daily contemplative lives of these monks at Perth remains quite elusive. Carn v. Gorman has evidenced secular people gaining access to the monks for spiritual guidance at the London Charterhouse, and Anselm J. Gribben has explored the role of the Carthusians, a Carthusian at Sheen, acting as a confessor to Cardinal Henry Beaufort, which involved both visits to the monk's cell as well as written communications. However, this type of access to the Perth community is not something that we can yet prove. Moreover, the nature of the surviving documentary evidence could easily encourage the continued entrenchment of cynical ideas about the corrupt nature of monastic institutions, as it is primarily made up of the documents designed to record the financing of the institution. This is relatively common across religious institutions in pre-Reformation Scotland, as much Catholic material culture and many textual sources were destroyed, concealed or lost during the Reformation. And it was the wealth and landholdings of these institutions that was of highest priority to those who received the post-Reformation dispersal of such. However, as Richard Oram has argued when looking broadly at donations to Scottish religious institutions, this same body of documentation can provide insights into why people made the donations. In particular, he has encouraged closer consideration of the pro anima clauses within them. This is those clauses that relate to actions undertaken on behalf of the soul of the person who is making the grant. This in turn also has the potential to offer information about the monk's contemplative and pious activities. Gorman has argued that rather than a remote vacuum, Carthusian houses were regarded as dynamic spaces that served as a meeting point between this world and the next. The wording of many of the grants of the Carthusian community of Perth emphasises their role as a conduit for the protection and care of souls of both the dead and the living, It's beyond the scope of this talk to investigate all such grants, of course, but I hope that considering a few examples will reveal the potential of such as an important avenue for future research. So central to this analysis is an early charter of Elizabeth Dunbar, in which she resigned her rights to the Hospital of St Leonard's to the Carthusians at Perth in 1438. Benefactors such as Elizabeth illustrate in their grants a strong belief in the potency of the prayers of the Carthusians for the souls of themselves, both living and dead, and as a means of preparing for the Day of Doom, or Judgment Day. The reason why the Carthusians' prayers may have been considered particularly valuable has been explored in other contexts, particularly in England. In Scotland, Aldred Hogg has demonstrated that 6 of the monks of Perth were commended with the highest order of praise, meaning those that lived the most praiseworthy lives from the order, from the Grand Chartreuse of the Mother House between 1519 and 1569. This suggests that the reputation and exemplary behaviour of the Perth Carthusians was noteworthy beyond Scotland. And the fact that the 16th century saw a relatively steady stream of grants to the Charterhouse indicates that their reputation was also well known enough locally for people to continue to seek their help when their judgment came. For example, John Paul, Burgess of Perth, particularly focuses on the prayers for the judgment and health of himself and his wife Janet Lamb and all the souls of the faithful dead when he makes his grant in 1500. Gifts to the Carthusians at Perth into the 1500s continue to illustrate that the grantors had, as Oram suggests, open quote, a belief in and understanding of the theological principles of salvation, redemption and purgation, close quote, and sought the assistance of the Carthusians in navigating the complexities of this spiritual salvation. Elizabeth Dunbar's grant also emphasises that women, as well as men, were active benefactors of the Carthusians. While the house at Perth was, of course, co-founded by a woman, James's wife, Joan Beaufort, it's not clear what level of physical access Joan or other women would have had to the Charterhouse, as the Carthusian rule was particularly strict in relation to women. However, the Chartreuse de Champmol, which I previously mentioned, was co-founded as a mausoleum by Margaret of Flanders and her husband, Duke Philip of Bold, Philip the Bold even, was designed, linguists argued, to facilitate a degree of access, including for its female founder Margaret, even if her access was more restricted than that of her husband. Whilst their physical access to the precinct may have been limited, Perth's female population certainly sought out Carthusian prayers. Elizabeth's grant is the only one identified to date that is clearly initiated by a woman, but the prominence of women in the prayers of the Carthusians through the grants of their husbands is really notable. In addition to Janet Lamb, who I already mentioned, there are also substantial numbers of named wives and mothers who are either joint donors or whose souls are being supported through these Carthusian intercessions, such as Elizabeth, wife of William de Wind, one of the Charterhouse's earliest patrons. These grants also highlight the importance of wider family and familial networks in the grantor's spiritual aims. So this is the list from Elizabeth's grant of the people that whose souls she was including wanted to be included in her prayers. As well as her direct relatives, it also includes the family of Sir Henry Wardlaw, Archbishop of St Andrews, and his siblings and their children, offering insights into her wider connections that can give us a really interesting way of looking into the networks that these people were involved in life as well. For others, there is evidence of named individuals, such as William Andrews' brother John in 1452, and unnamed individuals, such as the parents of William Trippis and Christine Simmons in 1527. And there are often references to unnamed predecessors and successors, which is quite common. And in the case of William de Wind, his grant stipulates that his successors must continue to honour the grant with no break in the provision. The expectation that subsequent generations would continue to honour such arrangements is indicated in the recurrence of family names in the surviving documents relating to the Charterhouse, even after its destruction, particularly the confirmations of charters made by initial predecessors, such as one we have by John Ross of Craigie, who is confirming the grant that was made by relatives in previous generations. This is an area that's ripe for opportunity of further research. Breeden's work on, which looks at the British Isles more generally, but more specifically English charter houses, explores family connections in the bequests to these charter houses and has identified several examples of continued benefaction over generations, such as the de la Pole family, who were founders of the Carthusian Charterhouse at Hull, through an analysis of wills of family members. The survival of will evidence is, for this period in Scotland, is less prolific than it is in England. Nonetheless, the names can still provide a means of tracing family involvement through charters and lease agreements, as well as going outward from there into the rich surviving borough and incorporated trade records held at the Perth and Kinross Archive, and offer an important means of further exploring the social networks that intersected at this religious foundation. In addition to the insights into the benefactors, these documents also provide means of making suggestions about the devotional lives in which they were investing by looking at what they expected in return. Elizabeth's grant states that the prayers should be said in perpetuity to the Day of Judgment, but she is less clear about how and when those prayers would have been incorporated. However, in some cases, the grantors were far more prescriptive. So, for example, James Stewart, Earl of Buchan, requested in 1498, in returns for the gardens that he gifted to the monks, he asks for prayers to be said annually on the date of his death, as well as one mass of repose to be celebrated, cum nota for my soul and the souls of the above written, and he has quite a list of souls that he's requesting prayers for. And it also speaks to the performance of vigils the night before the anniversary as well. So it's almost like an annual mini funeral that's being prepared each year. In requesting such, Buchan offers insights into the liturgical activities of the monks undertaken in honour of the requests of their benefactors. It also appears that the Carthusian community were made responsible for the maintenance and upkeep of perpetual prayers for the soul beyond the confines of the precinct. So I apologise, this one's in Latin because I haven't had a chance to fully translate it yet, but I'll tell you roughly what some of it says. So, for example, this grant made to the prior and the convent by William Trippis, who was a burgess, also requests that they facilitate the continuation of a perpetual chaplain tasked with the offering of prayers for the soul of Trippis and his wife, their parents, and the other faithful dead at the altar of St. Peter's in the parish church. Whilst in a founding charter of an altar in honour of St. Bride's at the cathedral in Dunkeld, and the provision of such with the chaplain, James Fenton put the responsibility for that altar in the hands of the Carthusians after his death. Further investigation into these types of charters and associated records offers us opportunities to better understand how these grants might have forged wider connections between the Carthusians and other religious entities in Perth and the surrounding area. Elizabeth Grant and others that I've referred to here, plus many others like them, clearly illustrate that although James I and Joan Beaufort were the initial founders of the Carthusian house, they were definitely not its only benefactors, and many others contributed to supporting this religious institution. When looking at contemporary Carthusian foundations in England, Breeden's identifies that after death, after the death of the founder, various other individuals contributed physically to the structure through the endowment of individual cells for monks, and in the case of Coventry, local notables also contributed to completing the church and the cloister. At Mount Grace in Yorkshire, Coppack and Keene, note that the armorial shields that you can see here either side of the doors of the cells, well, I've got a pointer, and here, and here, so that they have noted that these armorial shields found at the doors of the cells indicate this cell sponsoring activity was also occurring there. To date, specific references to the sponsoring of a cell by a benefactor at Perth have not been located. However, there is strong evidence that members of the Yorkshire Carthusian House of Mount Grace were involved in the early work at Perth, as the Prior of Mount Grace, Thomas Lockrington, assessed the site and its endowments at Perth in 1429, and the monk who accompanied him, Brother Dan Bryce, became a monk of that house. Additionally, the charter confirmation of John Ross of Craigie, mentioned above, indicates that his family donated stone from their quarry for the building and repairing of the Carthusian properties, making this another interesting avenue for further research, and one which may help with masonry tracing activities, which I'll be talking about more towards the end of the talk. So consequently, while the physical proximity of the Charterhouse to the borough caused some conflict and tension between the urban and monastic community, from its founding through to the mid-16th century, it also inspired the urban population to offer gifts to the community in return for supporting their spiritual well-being in many ways. The nature of these grants and the expectations found therein demonstrate the ways in which this largely insular community could have far-reaching and deep-felt connections to the population of the borough beyond the practical management of its land holdings and episodes of conflict which currently dominate the historiography. However, these connections and investments did not, unfortunately, save the Charterhouse from the same fate that befell the other religious houses in the vicinity of Perth when the Reformation came. Lacking above-ground remains for the Charterhouse at Perth, explorations of the documentary evidence and contemporary comparators has also proven incredibly useful in determining the extent of the Charterhouse precinct and even what the Charterhouse might have looked like, which was essential for undertaking any archaeological activities, and it will be these activities that form the focus of the rest of the talk. So you've seen this one before, apologies about that. Drawing on the initial archival research that I undertook, supported by a Geoffrey Barrow Award and with kind permission of the King James VI Hospital managers to take photos of the records, Richard Oram and Gavin Lindsay undertook a map regression exercise to identify historical boundaries and divisions across the broad area where the Charterhouse is thought to have been located. A reorientated overlay of Mount Grace's plan was found to have quite a close fit for these unusual historical boundaries noted in Perth's historic maps. There must be caution in taking one site alone as an exemplar, but as noted above, significant evidence supports looking at Mount Grace as one of the models for the house at Perth. Brother Dan Bryce of Mount Grace came to be a monk at Perth, receiving 100 nobles directly from the Scottish Crown for his services in 1434-5, and could have been in the position to influence the design as it was constructed. As you can see from this reconstruction model, the complex at Mount Grace had all the same features as Claremont that I showed earlier, with the relatively small monastic church in the centre, the individual cells and gardens around a cloister at the back, and an outer court with a gate, guest accommodation and functional buildings at the front. Using the knowledge generated from this research, it was within this search area that I showed on the map previously that we aimed to undertake non-intrusive geophysical survey based on the best probability of encountering remains of monastic buildings or robber trenches. So in 2024 we secured funding, including a £3,000 grant from the Strathmartin Trust, and worked with Dr. Sue Ovenden of AOC Archaeology, who advised on GPR as the most appropriate technique to apply to the investigation of the Charterhouse site. We decided to focus on the areas within A at the top and B in the middle, not A at the bottom. We prioritised those properties in the King Street area in Area B rather than those on the east of James Street in the first phase, as this gave us some of the most sizable and connected spaces for undertaking the scans. The next stage involved getting the support of relevant homeowners, property managers, business and charity owners, and local authority, road network and parking teams. And this work was undertaken by Gavin as our community liaison, for which we also managed to secure funding. There was incredible enthusiasm, interest and cooperation from the community, and we facilitated a site visit and opportunities to speak to the AOC team and ourselves to encourage this engagement. Only one non-resident property owner withheld permission from the survey, and that's where the little cross has popped up next to the B. And the other area we couldn't scan is the cross up at the top there, because that was inside the garage, which they had agreed that we could scan, but it's got a reinforced concrete floor, which made that very difficult for the GPR scanning equipment. It is important to comment upon the fact that AOC Archaeology team were faced with considerable challenge, as they required areas no smaller than 5 metres long and 2 metres wide to be clear of obstacles to allow the GPR scanning equipment on its wheeled cart to be pushed along in straight and evenly spaced lines. This may sound quite straightforward, but with this urban space consisting of a challenging patchwork of 27 individual survey areas varying in shape, size and ground surface, including gardens, lawns, pavements, plant beds, driveways, car parks, hard-standing public roads and pavements. So while the GPR survey covered a relatively small physical area of 1,000 square metres, this was dispersed across a densely built-up urban area of around 100 metres wide and 250 metres long. In reflecting on this process, those involved realised that a GPR survey of this size and patchwork nature had not been attempted before in Perth, likely not in Scotland and possibly not even the UK. This makes the survey a really interesting one beyond the scope of its discoveries in relation to the Charterhouse. However, it also meant that the data presented a formidable challenge, both in terms of assembling it into meaningful visual composite results and then also interpreting what that data might mean. Ultimately, it remains unclear what many of the anomalies relate to, natural or human-made, and if they are traces of human activity, then whether they are modern or historic and when in history they might date from. However, of particular interest are a series of parallel linear trends that we have and zones of high amplitude. That's a response that may indicate buried structural remains or surfaces near the junction of King Street and Victoria Street, which is the one marked A1. At the bottom we've got sort of 3 to 4 lines across there. These occurred at a considerable depth, beginning at 1.5 metres and continuing down beyond 2 metres, and they don't align with any of the current street plan established in the 19th century or any post-medieval features or boundaries recorded in the earlier maps of Perth. Linear trends on this same alignment and approximate depth were picked up further north on King Street with the junction of Charterhouse Lane at A2, and there's an interesting 90-degree bend at B, so I'm going to don't use the pointer again after last time. Here. There's a corner shape there, 90-degree turn, which is also on the same alignment as these anomalies and could be the corner of a building. Given their alignment and depth, it is possible that these trends represent surviving traces of the Carthusian monastery. But if that is the case, exactly which specific buildings, ranges or other elements of the complex they relate to still remains unclear. Moving up to the King James VI Hospital grounds, the survey, which is up in the top right-hand corner, which is marked F, these complement and add greater clarity to the geophysical resistance responses that were recorded there in 1995 in a smaller area. So these could relate to buildings arranged around the priory's outer court. At Mount Grace, this comprised of guest house, stables, stores, a granary and grain processing facilities, and it had the sole entrance place of the gatehouse. At Perth, we don't know exactly where the gate was located, but documentary evidence suggests it may have been on the west side of the precinct, facing away from the town, in an area that is less accessible in the initial scanning data, which is up this side here. The nature of the responses in this area around the hospital, at depths closer to 1 metre and shallower than the anomalies lower down on the site, suggests that these could be later remains, but as we are also interested in the use and reuse of the site from the destruction of the Charterhouse onwards as much as the Charterhouse itself, these are equally interesting. The GPR survey has also identified other linear features that might relate to water delivery around the outer court and inner courts, such as at C1 and C2 down here at the bottom. We know that other comparative Carthusian houses had complex water systems for the provision of clean running water to all of the individual cells, and documentary evidence points for similar at Perth. These are all very tentative suggestions for obvious reasons at this stage, and there is much work still to be done, but these have been exciting steps for the project. In recognition of the large number of community partners who contributed, most notably the residents who permitted access to undertake GPR survey across the grounds of their properties, we held a community conversation event in late March 2025 to give them the priority access to the results of the GPR. This took place in the Tayside Christian Fellowship Garden Room, which sits on the site, and they also very gratefully they permitted us to scan their garden as well as kindly offering the hall free of charge for the event. And with the kind support of Society of Antiquaries on the day, Jeff from the Society of Antiquaries made tea for a lot of people. At the event, over 70 local residents and stakeholders and other friends of the project attended to find out about the results, learn more about the Carthusian monastery, including a selection of original documents being on display, drawn from an earlier collaborative exhibition that I did with the archive in 2022, and explore where the Charterhouse Project can go next through a roundtable discussion and via anonymous feedback forms to prioritise suggested ideas and offer new additional suggestions as illustrated on this slide. This is our feedback form. As we move forward, we are really keen to draw on the community-based participatory research and public history approaches, where activities, priorities and objectives are co-created and community-driven, and put these at the heart of the project. This community conversation event and the forms that people filled out provided an essential step in this process and an opportunity for the team, partners and wider community to meet, share ideas and steer the project onto its next directions. Since March, using the priorities identified by the attendees of the community conversation, which singled out the top 4 on this list as the main priorities, but with also a keen interest identified in relation to the archival searches and also the sustainability activities, we have been working quietly behind the scenes, exploring the possibilities in terms of activities, their associated costs, potential funding opportunities, as well as potential partners to help with both securing funding and undertaking activities. This has been quite a productive time, and we are looking forward to the next stages of moving these activities forward. For example, in relation to the community stone and cellar basement surveys, we've been working with a medieval stone masonry expert, including an initial walk round to work out the potential of this type of activity. As the priory was being sold off for building material within a few years of the Reformation, there is little evidence of its construction, particularly as the royal financial materials for the early 15th century are problematic and significant evidence of James's early investments in the building are lacking. However, from the few descriptions of its beauty, we knew it was constructed of high quality carved and dressed stone, and that the selling off and looting of materials led to some survivals. For example, on the left of the slide is the portion of a grave slab of Dean William Turnbull, who was a procurator of the Charterhouse, who's on record in that role at the Charterhouse in 1503, and this is found reused as a stair lintel in the Tower of Lethendy, which is 17 kilometres north of Perth. Further salvaged elements include a very richly decorated doorway on the right into the easternmost bay of the choir of St John's Kirk. Although this no longer survives, it was captured, thankfully, in an engraving of 1775. It is thought to have been removed from the Charterhouse and installed in the kirk to provide an access for the congregation to the east in the subdivision of the medieval parish church after the Reformation. In our walk around, we sought to make observations about potential for reused masonry from these medieval buildings in more modern structures in the southern area of the borough, such as parts of St Leonard's Bank near the train station. This has allowed us a better understanding of the viability of a stone survey that could be undertaken by community members, following workshops to build skills in identifying and recording such, and this is something we're quite excited about doing. So Perth's Carthusian monastery is lost as a physical entity, as was the fate of much of Scotland's Catholic material heritage, but can collective efforts to rediscover the historical narrative of our place of the Charterhouse offer a means of awakening connections to place and creating shared community memories in the present? This is not a question that can be answered at this time, but it is one that sits at the core of the project's past, present and future. During its existence as a functioning religious institution, the Charterhouse had significantly more complex connections with the communities around it than perhaps envisaged previously. While these are not yet fully understood, the initial investigations into the surviving documentary evidence for the Carthusians in Perth in the first half of the talk speaks to the ways that these connections could be fruitfully explored in the future, either by traditional methods or our hope would be in collaboration with local communities to better understand the pious activities and beliefs of Perth residents in the century leading up to the Reformation. The nature of the relationship and the potential connections between this lost monastic site and the modern residents and community is still being developed and defined. Ultimately, it is not our place as academics, but rather it is their or your place. Consequently, the direction of the research for the Perth Charterhouse Project needs to sit in the hands of the wider collective of stakeholders and residents as much as it does ours. There is plenty of potential challenges and pitfalls to place-based heritage and community participatory practices that must be addressed, but there are also benefits that are still to be fully explored and understood. The enthusiasm of the current stakeholders, particularly our resident homeowners and businesses, for getting involved in the project and making their voices heard in ways thus offered, have been exciting and positive steps in the project's development in recent years. Moving forward, we need to continue to create and facilitate the spaces for dialogue in which their voices can be heard and listened to, so that the telling of their place's history and the connections and collective memories that are forged in doing so can be truly transformative and facilitate a genuine democratisation of knowledge making about the past. Thank you very much for your time, and I welcome your questions.
Big number of people here. I'm sure there'll be lots and lots of questions, and I'm not sure how to take them, but we'll just do this side of the room. Yes.
The machine that you've been using to, find the different depths and what they are at different depths, would they work through floorboards of buildings that are there to give you a bit more knowledge?
I'm going to look at an archaeologist in the room who might be able to answer that question. Depends what's under the floorboards, doesn't it, David?
It does. The airspace under the floorboards might confuse the results, but there may be some clever electronic way of tuning that out. Because you'd get a sort of bounce of the signal off the, as it were, the solum under the floorboards, which might confuse everything. But Susan Ovenham would be the right person to answer this.
Exactly.
But I suspect something could be done depending on how big the airspace was and, as you were saying, what's under it.
That might be an option to look at.
The problem is also that to get sensible results, you need to have your survey pathway evenly spread out.
Yeah.
It can't just be sort of at random, and doing that inside an ordinary building is really quite difficult.
Going to sweep across the room. Yes, next, yes.
Were you able to trace what happened to the doorway once it left St John's?
Not yet, unfortunately. We don't know what happened to it when it left St John's, but it is something we want to look into because there might be records of that.
In the front.
It's more of a comment than anything else. Just to put it in perspective, the amount of records that Lucy's got to look at would take a team of 6 people a decade at least. Some of the documents can take 2 or 3 days, and even after that you might need to come back to it. So one document can actually take weeks or even months to transcribe or translate. Another thing is you can't blame King James VI Hospital for any of the destruction, because although all the Catholic lands were transmitted to the charity in 1569, There were actually 2 royal charters and 2 acts of parliament. The rapacious town council, the Kirk session, and all the other greedy so-and-sos in Perth made sure that every inch of land and every property they could get their hands off, they stole from the charity. It's called appropriation, by the way. So even the grounds the charity, the Carthusian monastery stood on, were actually purloined and used by, not by the charity. The charity actually had no premises for most of its existence. There you go, that's just a little nosy of what's gone on subsequently.
And thank you about the documents. Yes, they're not the easiest set of records, and there's some that are quite badly damaged now as well, in terms of like the fading of text and marks and holes and things. So there's a lot of patchwork, guesswork around some of that, which can be quite challenging.
Yes.
I was thinking about the social standing of the monks themselves, looking at how big and spacious and comfortable their houses seem to have been on 2 stories, and the generally rather civilized conditions in which they lived. Do we know a lot about the social stratum from which they come, and to which they return once they are kicked out of the monastery? That seems like a strand of inquiry.
Yes, definitely. So we've started to collect names of individuals where we can find them. They're quite hard to come by, but there are some really interesting charters, particularly towards the point at which they know everything's possibly coming to an end, where you have quite a lot of the monks' signatures on those charters. And one of the, I think it's Breeden talks about, they were allowed, from the rule, they were allowed to come together and speak once a week about useful things. We don't know what useful things was, but I suspect it was signing charters and that sort of thing. And so we do occasionally have glimpses of the population, but it's then a case of having to go away and dig into each one of those individuals. We know that the priors were usually of relatively high standing. We know that a number of the original monks were coming from elsewhere rather than Perth, but there's a lot more familiar names the later you come, so they're obviously attracting more people from the locality the longer that they're there. We know that monastic houses often attracted younger sons of wealthy families, but there's definitely an illegitimate son of James V ends up in there, for example. So there are those sorts of individuals, but it is a case of we're going to have to do a lot of tracing of those names, and that's not a task I've managed to get to yet. But we've started making collection of all the named monks that we can identify, and there has been some work on starting to identify some of those individuals. In terms of what happens to them afterwards, there's an interesting split. I think there's about 10 of them left at the end. And some of them go to France, we presume, to a Carthusian house in France. But others of them stay within the community of Perth. Some of them end up outside of the borough, but some of them end up being housed in the borough. And there's records of basically the community continuing to support them within the community. So I think that one of the things I need to look into with those individuals is how long they're sustaining them for. One of them's definitely till the end of his life. They are, I find it really interesting that they are really supportive of the individuals that are leaving the monastic community. So it is really, and they still talk about it as our place in any of the later documents that you have in relation to them. And they do talk about each other as brethren still, so they're still talking in terms of being a community even once that community is dispersed, which I find really fascinating as well.
Thanks, Lucy. That was a great talk. Can you hear me okay? I can't hear myself okay. I'm going to ask 2 questions if that's all right. The first one is, what's the latest dated document you found in relation to the Charterhouse itself, not the hospital, but the Charterhouse? And second, you mentioned James Fenton from the 1520s. Could you tell us a bit more about him?
The first one is an interesting one because the Charterhouse, the Charterhouse lands and our place of the Charterhouse is discussed significantly later than the building being destroyed.
That's what I thought.
Yeah, absolutely.
Like 1590s?
Later.
Kind of, yeah.
Later,
Yeah.
it's still being called that. And there's references to it still being called Charterhouse lands, Charterhouse yards. A dovecot in Charterhouse yards is something that's a big debate over because somebody lets it go to rack and ruin, and there's crows and people are very cross about it. And in each of there's receipts. They're here actually, they're wonderful. There's receipts where the Kirk sessions are paying the minister, and but in each of them it refers to the lands of the Charterhouse. So it echoes through the textual record. It's fascinating
really
the time that it goes through. Now I'm going to have to ask me about James Fenton, and I'm going to have to go.
That's all right,
check.
it's fine. It's just I've come across him
which-
myself in a different context, so I'm intrigued to find anyone else mentioning him ever.
He was the one that was to do with Dunkeld, wasn't he? I think.
Yes.
So at the moment, I've only got 2 records that name him, but I can definitely find you the reference.
Let's be in touch, because I've got him reading Boethius in Dunkeld in 1506.
Brilliant. Yes, we can.
Let's have a coffee.
Yeah.
All right, thanks, Lucy.
Somebody right in the middle. Are you able to shout? Can you shout?
I can vote project, yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Well, thank you for a lovely talk. Bearing in mind how much material you've had to dig through, I apologise in advance because I'm going to ask about two questions really. You mentioned the pro anima clauses and potential for family connections to be enlightened through those clauses, and one of the charters was obviously from James Stewart, the Earl of Buckingham. In that extensive pro anima clause, do you remember at all if he mentioned any Beaufort connection to his, I think his mother was the founder, was Jones?
I don't think there is, but I can definitely look back for you.
And secondly, I did wonder then, in a different side of the Beaufort family, whether there was, you've been able to come across any reason why Margaret Tudor was later interred in the Charterhouse other than proximity. Is there any interest there from?
There's no obvious interest from Margaret herself. James V, however, is quite interested in what's going on at the Charterhouse. He puts up a defence when there's a tussle between 2 potential priors. So he has quite a strong interest in it. Interesting that letter from James III is one where he is particularly mentions the fact that forefathers created this mausoleum, and I think that carries on through the other Stuarts. So while it doesn't tend to be the main focus of any of their patronage, there is that interest, and it recurs with most of them that there is a connection and an interest, that the Charterhouse priors do seem to get an audience with the king when they want one, and so I think that for James it is partly proximity, but it's proximity with huge royal value. So it's that connection, I think, that's important. I don't think there's a Beaufort reference in that charter, but I can definitely go back and have a look for you.
Now, does anybody else near the middle want to ask a question? No pressure. Okay, pass it back. Right, way around the other side.
Ishbel's going to be getting her steps up tonight.
Just in the middle.
Just want to ask, roughly how many...
Hang on.
Go behind.
Hang on a moment.
I like to speak loud to the new because I can speak through this thing. Given that there's a fairly standard layout for a charter house, and you often a regular number of cells, and then you've got a church which is orientated, and then you've got the outer yard. Have you tried dropping a plan like that on top of the site?
Yes, that plan earlier on. So I'll go back to it so you can see. It's going to take me a minute because it's like put fancy bits in between the slides, so I can't quickly click between them. But yes, it's this Charterhouse, the Mount Grace Charterhouse, that we put a plan of, because when we did Gavin and Richard did the map regressions and looked at the old boundaries, the boundaries that have the most can go back the furthest, they were not dissimilar to that shape. So it's flipped over, but that's Mount Graves. We haven't done it with all of the cells in the church in that shape, because we don't know if that's exactly the line that it was sitting on, and we don't want to presume, because they are standard in the sense that they all have the cells all have gardens, but the cells are of different sizes at different charter houses. They were arranged differently. Sometimes they're in a square, sometimes they're on an off-centre square, and the churches are of varying sizes. So all of these things are problematic in taking one place as a model. It's just, and they also were very aware of their surroundings, so they were building into the surroundings that they were in. So that's not exactly the same shape as Mount Grace. It's slightly different. So that's the challenge with trying to layer a plan over the top that we would have, which is why we're trying not to be tempted to do it, because we don't want to presume where things might be.
But given that the church would be east-west,
yes.
Would the monk cells normally be on the north of that, or on the south, or does that vary?
So that varies as well. It varies on where they are and what they're close to. So we're fairly certain that the cells would have been at the back of this site because of a couple of descriptions. George Foreman mentioned cells being at the back in one of the charters post-Reformation when things are being granted elsewhere. But also because it was very unusual for them to be by a borough. So the London one is another exception to the rule, but actually it was quite unusual for them to be this close to a town because they wanted isolation. So the monks would have been as far as possible within the site, away from the noise of the borough. And we think that's also why the gate was on the other side, so that people had to come round to the entrance.
And I suppose the last thing is pomarium.
Yep. So it can be orchard. It could also mean a space of wilderness or a space of the outside, which is interesting as well if you think that it is the line that the Charterhouse chose to not enclose within its walls, but to have something between them and the road. But yes, we know that it was arable land and it was orchards. We also know that the monks leased it to other people even while it was a functioning monastery. So we have some of the records of that, parts of that being leased to local families, and it's interesting because then you have the local families trying to desperately hang on to it after the Reformation as well. So you have sort of an onward trace of that. There's some really interesting records around the Pomarium area to dig into. We haven't got that far yet, but yeah, they're there, and we're really interested in it.
You can pass it down, yes. Thank you.
Just a very general question as to roughly how many of these charter houses were there in Britain as a whole?
In Britain as a whole, there are significantly more in England. Total number, I'd have to go and check that for you, but there are significantly more in England. The one in Yorkshire, there was a lot founded in the same period though in England. There are older houses in England, but the majority of them come in that later period of popularity. They are a mixture of rural and close to urban sites. So there's one at Hull, there's one at Coventry, but none of them are quite as close into the town when they were built. Obviously towns expand and they would now have been swallowed within. The London Charterhouse now is right is right in the centre of London, but if you look at old maps it was right on the edge.
Okay, okay. One more. We'll maybe allow one or two more questions and then we'll...
I was wondering what would be your approach for the James Street properties, because we actually just bought one last year. And the old snooker hall that's out the back between James Street and King Street, there's a demolition order on that and they started working on it. It's going to be taken down to floor slab level and they're going to take down the wall that's on the boundary of our property. And our coal shed has just like slabs and then a dirt floor and everything as well. But what would you expect to find on that edge of the site? Because it seems quite kind of peripheral almost, I suppose. I did read that there's been a dump maybe of sandstone in what was Graham Place.
Yeah. So it depends on whether the cells are where we think they are. So if So James Street. It would be on the edge, but it could be the walls. It could be the edge of cells if it was down that far. So we don't know yet what we would potentially find in different areas. That's the biggest challenge that we have. So one of the things that we want to do, other than hopefully put some holes in the ground at some point, around in areas that's possible, is to expand that GPR scanning. So at the moment it's only in that area because we only got X amount of money and we had to be realistic about what we could do in that time. And that area that we covered where we thought the centre-ish might be. It also included quite a lot of sections that could be easily put together, and for the people putting that together, that wasn't me, they need more of the connectable bits. But the idea would be that we'd like to expand that scanning to at least have all of the area that we think it might have covered scanned.
Thank you. One more.
Have any
Wait for the mic.
Have any original stones been found, or possibly original stones been found so far?
Original stones, other than the grave slab that I showed you, we don't know. We've identified.
So the answer is no, they haven't been found.
No, they haven't been found. But when we were walking around doing the initial look, our medieval stone masonry expert was very excited about some of the stones that we found, built into much more recent but still old walls. And the reason for that was some of the unusual shapes, the significant size of some of the stones, and in comparison to some of the highly engineered Victorian stonework near it, they were very unusual shapes. So she's keen to think that they might be, but she's still working on analysis of that.
So potentially they could be.
Potentially they could be. That's why I didn't want to say no, because it's potentially.
Thank you. I want to say special thanks to Ishbel McKinnon, who's done a lot of work as well as buzzing around keeping everything organised tonight, the preparatory stuff, sending me all the information and making sure I was here on time. To the Friends of the Archive, as ever, for all their interest and all the work that's done. And I need to include the P&K Archive as well, because the two kind of go hand in hand. To PNS, Historical and Archaeological section, some folk belong 1, 2 or 3 of these organisations. To my friends and colleagues in the Civic Trust for all their help and support. And to P&K Culture, which is always supportive of any of these events that are going on. And so thank you to everyone. It's really a pleasure to be here. But the final thanks goes to Lucy. You've lifted the lid, if I might say, metaphorically at least, but in as real terms as you can, on the subject that we're fascinated by. It's interesting the interaction we have with the Reformation. And I was present at St John's Kirk, when I don't know, many of you maybe were there, when Tom Winning came as Archbishop to preach for the first time ever in Knox's pulpit since the Reformation. And that was quite an occasion. We could talk about it for half an hour, we don't have time to say. But I think the reverberation of what the Reformation and the new museum, keep calling it the new museum, reflects on that, and the fact that it's cheek to jowl by the Kirk of St John is a marvellous opportunity for real cultural tourism. Yeah. And you've enhanced that greatly tonight, because the next time I walk along there, I'm going to wonder, where's the line for this place? You'll see folk walking along all around. You'll have folk coming to your homes. Like folk chapping on the door. Can we drill here? Type of thing. But it's given us a great enlightenment on the subject, which I think most of us knew. Some of us knew quite a lot about, but most of us knew a little bit about. So and it's made it real, which I think is really, really important. So thank you very much for the work that you've done. Thank you for what you're going to do. And as we sometimes say, Grace, for what we're about to receive. I think you will be certainly, whatever organisation it is, will be asked back, because we'll all want to know what the report is after X time, and I'm not going to put a time on that. These things that you correctly say, there's a huge volume of information. And once you find one bit, of course, it just leads you on to the next one.
Yeah.
So please put your hands together for Lucy.